Imagine a gun so powerful that each shot feels less like a tank firing and more like a small natural disaster tearing chunks of earth out of the landscape. Imagine a vehicle that, at first glance, looks like an ordinary British post-war tank rolling across a grey proving ground under a low, wet sky. Then the camera rises, the angle changes, and you suddenly see what really sits on its hull. Instead of a familiar rounded turret, there is a huge boxy structure, like a metal garden shed welded onto the roof, with a grotesquely long barrel jutting from its front. This is not a normal fighting vehicle. This is a brute of steel built around a single idea: one shot, one dead enemy tank. This machine is the FV4005, a British attempt to build the ultimate tank killer in the uneasy years after the Second World War. On paper, it was terrifying, a combination of a reliable Centurion hull and a gun so oversized that it belonged more on a coastal battery than on a battlefield full of mud and narrow bridges. In reality, it became something else entirely. It turned into a case study in how fear and worst-case planning can push even cautious engineers toward designs that flirt with the edge of absurdity. The FV4005 never fired a shot in anger, yet it stood.
To understand how Britain ended up balancing a steel shed and a colossal gun on a tank chassis, we have to step back to the last years of the Second World War and the first tense decade that followed. Europe was shattered. Cities were ruins, economies exhausted, populations traumatized. But even as people tried to rebuild, a new line of tension began to harden across the continent. The wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union dissolved into suspicion. Speeches, border incidents, and political crises gradually transformed former comrades into potential enemies. The Cold War was settling over Europe, and nobody yet knew what shape the next conflict might take. In London, officers at the War Office hunched over photographs and intelligence reports that arrived from Eastern Europe. On the grainy black and white images, Soviet heavy tanks rolled across parades in Moscow, their tracks clattering across cobblestones, their long guns pointing towards some imagined enemy. Each year, the silhouettes seemed to grow bulkier, the armor thicker. Names like IS-3 and IS-4 passed from report to report, often accompanied by sketchy estimates of armor thickness and gun power. Some of these numbers were guesses, some were deliberate exaggerations. But to the people responsible for British defense, they painted a worrying picture of an adversary intent on fielding nearly invulnerable steel beasts. The British Army carried its own scars from the early years of the previous war, when its tanks had often been.
Out of that fear came a set of requirements that, when read today, almost sound like a challenge thrown at the laws of physics. The Army wanted a gun that could defeat extremely thick, sloped armor at long range, armor not unlike that found on naval turrets. It had to punch through or smash apart a plate many inches thick at distances where the target might barely be visible through a gun sight haze. It had to do this reliably, not just as a theoretical 1 in 100 lucky shot. Faced with this demand, the ordnance experts did not talk about incremental upgrades. They began to sketch something extreme. Instead of slightly enlarging existing tank guns, designers proposed a weapon in an entirely different weight class. The figure they circled around was roughly 183 millimeters, a caliber more at home on siege or coastal guns than on a vehicle meant to move with armored formations. When you consider that many successful tank guns of the era sat around 85 to 100 millimeters, the jump is staggering. This was not just a question of a bigger hole in the muzzle brake. It meant an entirely different scale of recoil, ammunition, and structural reinforcement. On paper, though, the advantages were tantalizing. A gun of that caliber firing specialized anti-armor shells promised terrifying destructive power. Instead of
From the first sketches, it was obvious that a conventional turret would not do. A 183mm gun required a huge breech,
a massive recoil system, and solid supports. Early paper studies produced an open-topped mounting with limited traverse, known later as Stage 1. In that configuration, the gun could only traverse a relatively narrow arc left and right, and the crew sat behind a shield more reminiscent of a traditional self-propelled gun. For a moment, it looked as if this might be acceptable. However, doctrinal thinking in the Army still favored all-round traverse. Tank destroyers that had to pivot the entire hull to change targets were seen as too vulnerable on a chaotic battlefield. So the designers were told to give the beast a full rotating turret. That demand turned a difficult engineering problem into an almost absurd one. To provide room for the gun and its recoil, to house the crew, and to allow ammunition handling, the turret would have to be enormous. Armor added to that volume would quickly push the total weight beyond what the Centurion's suspension could sensibly carry. The compromise they landed on is what would give the FV4005 its distinctive, almost comical appearance. A tall, angular steel box with relatively thin walls, perched on the tank hull like an oversized metal cabin. This Stage 2 turret looked unlike anything else in British service. Flat plates formed slab sides and a high rear bustle, all arranged with little attempt at elegant curves or complex shapes. The armor was thick enough to stop shell splinters and small arms fire, but it was a far cry from the heavy.
In the cramped interior, the crew layout reflected the gun's tyrannical demands. The commander and gunner sat toward the front of the turret, dealing with sights, controls, and radios, while also trying not to be crushed by the breech as it slammed back after each shot. Behind them worked two loaders, whose job was less about fine motor skills and more about brute strength and coordination. Underneath, in the hull, the driver still occupied his usual position, wrestling with steering levers and gears to keep the tank pointed where the commander needed it. Compared with more balanced vehicles, the human element here was clearly subordinated to the requirements of the weapon. Solving one set of problems created another. The new turret made the vehicle top-heavy. The higher you stacked steel plates and ammunition above the ring, the more care you had to take with turns, slopes, and side angles. The suspension was reinforced, torsion bars and components tweaked, but no amount of math could change the fact that the FV4005 was less forgiving of sudden maneuvers than an ordinary Centurion. Engineers shaved armor where they dared, trimmed away every kilogram they could justify, yet the silhouette remained tall and ungainly, the center of gravity uncomfortably high. Once a prototype was ready, the testing crews took over. On the move, the FV4005 behaved like a Centurion with a permanent piggyback rider. It could still traverse rough ground and climb slopes, but the drivers felt the difference in every lurch. Sharp turns were done with extra caution. The idea of racing this machine across uneven terrain with the abandon of a main battle tank was optimistic at best. For the men inside the turret, every bump translated into another reminder that a huge mass of steel towered above their heads.
The true character of the vehicle only revealed itself on the firing range. When the order came to test the gun, observers took up positions at what they considered a respectful distance. Engines idled down, the barrel elevated toward distant hulks of scrap armor. At the command to fire, the gun barked with a deep, violent roar that rolled across the range like thunder. The recoil system groaned and did its job, but even with all the hydraulic and mechanical damping in place, the entire tank shuddered as if struck. Dust leapt from the ground around it. Smaller vehicles parked nearby rocked on their suspensions, and everyone present felt the concussion in their chest. The gun, however, did exactly what it was supposed to do. Its projectiles smashed into target hulks downrange with horrifying effect. Armor plates that would have shrugged off conventional rounds shattered, buckled, or peeled open like thin metal under colossal explosive forces. Old hulls, used as test targets, collapsed inward or were torn into warped fragments. In that narrow sense, the FV4005 seemed to fulfill its monstrous promise. It was a single-purpose executioner designed to obliterate anything it hit.
Inside that rattling metal box, the real star of the show was not the turret at all, but the ammunition it existed to serve. The L4 gun was built around high-explosive squash-head shells, a distinctly British answer to the problem of heavy armor. Instead of a hard, sharp tip designed to punch a neat hole, these rounds carried a layer of plastic explosive under a soft nose. When the shells struck a tank, that nose spread the explosive across the armor like thick paint before the fuse detonated it. The blast sent a shockwave racing through the steel plate, forcing the inner surface to shed razor-sharp fragments that sprayed into the fighting compartment. Even if the armor never showed a clean penetration from the outside, life inside the target was over. For a weapon like this, size was everything. The 183mm projectiles were enormous, heavy cylinders that loaders could barely wrap their arms around. Each one weighed as much as a fully packed infantryman, and that was before you added the separate metal case filled with propellant. Inside the turret, these giant rounds were stored solemnly along the walls and in the bustle, like a row of thick steel coffins waiting for their moment. Space was so limited that only a small number of complete rounds could be carried. This was not a vehicle that would spray shells freely. Every shot was precious. A firing cycle inside the FV4005 looked less like the quick, repetitive movement of a typical tank crew and more like a brutal, tightly choreographed workout. After the gun recoiled, the breech slammed open and the acrid smell of propellant flooded the turret. One loader peeled away to the racks, heaving a projectile free and guiding its weight toward the open breech. The second loader braced himself, helping to lift and align the shell as they fed it into the hungry maw of the gun. Once the projectile was seated, they repeated the process with the propellant case, another heavy, awkward cylinder that had to be muscled into position. Only then could the breech close and the gunner begin to lay the weapon on the next target. On a cool day, on firm ground, with fresh muscles and no one shooting back, a crew might manage around a couple of rounds per minute. In combat, that optimistic figure would almost certainly shrink. British planners hoped that such a slow, punishing rate of fire would be compensated by lethality and accuracy at ranges where most other weapons faltered. The requirement for the new gun demanded that it defeat very thick, but there was a problem that no amount of raw power could erase. The heavy HESH shells left the barrel at a comparatively modest velocity. Over long distances, they flew more like artillery shells than streamlined tank rounds, spending more time in the air and giving the wind plenty of opportunity to push them off course. A crosswind that barely nudged a smaller, faster projectile could shove a 183mm shell surprisingly far from where the gunner intended it to land. Test reports noted that at the extreme ranges the Army had in mind, the accuracy simply did not inspire confidence. The vision of a sniper-like tank destroyer calmly picking off enemy heavies from beyond retaliation distance grew dimmer with every crater that bloomed a few meters from the target instead of on it. While these tests played out on British proving grounds, the wider world of warfare was evolving at a pace that threatened to leave the FV4005 standing still. Guided missile technology, once a tentative curiosity, was starting to mature. Anti-tank missiles promised to deliver tremendous armor penetration from relatively small launchers. A missile system could be mounted on light vehicles, helicopters, or even carried by infantry. It did not require a massive turret or a crew of loaders hauling half-man-sized shells around a cramped interior. At the same time, improvements in conventional tank guns and fire control systems meant that more standard calibers were closing the gap in performance without needing to push into such extreme territory. Within the British Army and defense establishment, debates grew more pointed. Some officers argued that missiles were still too new, too temperamental, too easy to disrupt. They preferred the tangible reliability of a big gun and a thick breech block. Others pointed at costs and logistics. Every FV4005 required a Centurion hull, a custom turret, in meticulous maintenance. Each enormous round consumed resources that could instead supply large volumes of more conventional ammunition. In an era of shrinking budgets and expanding commitments, the question loomed large. Was it wise to pour so much into a vehicle that excelled at only one narrow task? As further intelligence came in about Soviet tank development, the nightmare image that had originally driven the project began to soften. Heavy tanks certainly existed, and they were formidable, but the predicted wave of unstoppable supertanks failed to materialize in the numbers and forms once feared. Both blocks were inching toward a doctrine where the main battle tank, versatile rather than extreme, became the core of armored forces. The strategic niche that demanded a dedicated monster hunter armed with a 183mm hammer looked smaller every year. The FV4005 quietly slid down the list of priorities. It never received a full production order. Only a few prototypes were completed, each representing large amounts of steel, machining, and testing hours. One carried the Stage 1 mounting, open-topped and limited in traverse, while others bore the full slab-sided Stage 2 turret. They trundled around test tracks, fired their thunderous guns, and then were parked more and more often as attention and funding shifted to other programs. What had once been floated as a potential backbone of anti-tank defense now looked like an interesting but increasingly impractical experiment. From a broader perspective, the FV4005 highlights the harsh arithmetic of war. For the cost of building and maintaining a fleet of these specialized tank destroyers, the Army could field far more conventional tanks, invest in training, or accelerate missile programs. Each massive round represented not just explosives and metal, but time in factories and space in supply convoys. When planners compared what could be achieved with the same resources applied elsewhere, the appeal of one huge gun aimed at a shrinking problem dulled quickly. In the end, strategy tends to favor weapons that can do many things well over those that do one thing spectacularly. Years after the last official report closed the book on the FV4005, its story took an unexpected second life, not on the battlefield, but in workshops and museum yards. When the project was canceled in the late 1950s, the handful of prototypes and components were scattered among different institutions. One early Stage 1 mounting ended up at a proving ground, its Centurion chassis quietly reassigned to more humble duties. Another turret found a home at a military science college, where students could examine its strange, towering shape as a cautionary example of extreme specialization. A third turret remained for a time with the development establishment that had overseen the program, an impressive relic parked at the edge of a yard, slowly gathering dust. Over the years, many such experimental pieces of hardware simply disappeared. They were cut up for scrap when budgets tightened, or quietly reduced to raw metal when space was needed for newer projects. Yet one FV4005 turret escaped that fate. It eventually made its way to the Tank Museum at Bovington, where curators, recognizing its uniqueness, paired it with a spare Centurion hull. The result was a reconstructed vehicle that, while not an original complete prototype, faithfully represented what the FV4005 would have looked like had it rolled out of a factory in numbers. Tall, ungainly, with that monstrous barrel dominating its profile, it took its place among rows of more conventional armored vehicles. For a long time, the reconstructed tank sat outside, exposed to the kind of weather that Britain does best: damp, salty air, steady rain, and the occasional burst of harsh sunshine. Paint faded and flaked, rust crept along seams and edges, biting into plates, hinges, and bolts. Visitors still walked around it, staring up at the barrel, but the vehicle itself was quietly deteriorating under their gaze. What had already been a delicate balance of heavy gun and thin turret was being slowly undermined by corrosion. Left unchecked, the only surviving example of this remarkable machine would eventually crumble. Fortunately, a new wave of interest in armored history, fueled by historians, enthusiasts, and even digital recreations of the FV4005 in popular games, changed its fortunes. The Tank Museum launched a dedicated restoration project with the ambitious goal of returning the vehicle to running condition. This was not a simple cosmetic overhaul. It meant bringing the old Centurion hull back to life and ensuring that the great turret and gun could be safely displayed on a moving chassis. The museum found allies in the wider community, including commercial partners who contributed funds and publicity. For them, helping to restore such an odd, extreme vehicle was a way of preserving not just a tank, but a story. The restoration process itself mirrored, in reverse, the construction of the original prototypes. Technicians stripped the vehicle down, removing tracks, road wheels, and other components until they could examine the state of the bare hull. Corroded steel was cleaned, reinforced, or replaced. New sections were welded in where age and weather had eaten too deeply. Inside the engine bay, a refurbished Meteor V12 engine took the place of tired old machinery, its 12 cylinders once again ready to haul the heavy hull through mud and over grass. Cooling systems, fuel lines, gearboxes, and braking systems were pulled apart and rebuilt, each bolt turned by hands that understood they were not just fixing a machine, but reviving a piece of history. Meanwhile, the turret and gun received their own careful attention. The great barrel was inspected, cleaned, and treated against further corrosion. Internal fittings were repaired or recreated based on surviving drawings and photographs. The thin armor plates that had once been a compromise between weight and protection were now simply fragile shells that needed to be preserved. Layers of primer and fresh paint sealed the metal against the elements, restoring the stark, imposing look the FV4005 would have presented in its prime.
Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the restoration came when it was time to reunite turret and hull. On a clear day, cranes and rigging teams assembled around the waiting chassis. Slowly, inch by inch, the massive steel box of the turret was lifted from its supports and swung through the air, hanging for a moment like some industrial relic captured mid-flight. Below, the circular opening of the turret ring waited. With careful guidance and shouted instructions, the suspended turret descended, metal edges aligning with surprising precision. When it finally settled into place, steel meeting steel with a heavy, final sound, the FV4005 once again became a complete tank destroyer, not just a set of parts. When the restored machine moved under its own power in front of a crowd for the first time, many of those watching had only ever known it as a static exhibit or a virtual model. Seeing it rumble across the arena, tracks clanking, engine growling, and that monstrous gun sweeping gently as the hull turned, gave the FV4005 a new kind of presence. It was no longer only a symbol of Cold War anxiety, it had become a physical bridge between generations. Earlier engineers had built it in fear of a war that never came in the form they imagined. Modern restorers had revived it in the name of curiosity, education, and remembrance. In the end, the FV4005 never had the chance to do what it was designed for. It did not duel Soviet heavy tanks on the North German plain. It did not ambush columns of armor from concealed hull-down positions, its huge shell smashing enemy machines to ruined scrap. Instead, it spent its working life on test ranges and later in museum yards. The supertanks it was meant to counter never appeared in the expected numbers, and the tools that would shape future anti-tank warfare turned out to be sleeker missiles and smarter, more balanced main battle tanks.
The lesson this steel monster leaves us with is subtle but important. The most spectacular, most extreme weapon is not always the one that changes history. Often, it is the quieter, more flexible designs, the ones that compromise between firepower, protection, mobility, and cost that end up on the decisive battlefields. The FV4005 came from a place of genuine concern and serious engineering, yet it illustrates how easy it is to be seduced by the idea that bigger is always better.
that there is always a single, overwhelming answer to a complex threat. In the real world, physics, logistics, and changing strategy have their own say. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the strangest tank destroyers ever built, consider supporting the channel. Leave a like if the story of this absurdly large gun on a not-so-large tank kept you watching to the end. Tell us in the comments which other forgotten experiments, prototype weapons, or museum curiosities you would like to see in future episodes. And of course, subscribe so that you do not miss the next long exploration of the machines that almost changed the way wars are fought, but instead ended up as fascinating footnotes in military history.